The side deltoid is not connected to the clavicle. It's connected to that outer part of the scapula. Okay, that's important to know. So today, this particular portion right now, we're going to talk about specifically side deltoid. You can see it right there. You can see that the insertion is right there on the humerus. And you'll notice also that the rear deltoid and the front deltoid connect right next to it, right in back of the side deltoid insertion and right in front of the side deltoid insertion, right? So they pretty much all connect in the same spot, but they start in a different spot. So here's a nice angle to show you that if this muscle were to contract in the most basic, simple way, in other words, it would pull its insertion point right there. It would pull it straight up to the origin area right there, right? And that produces a side arm movement called lateral abduction. That is pure movement. That is pure lateral deltoid movement. As pure as bicep bends the elbow. That is a pure movement right there. Right? Now you can see I put a dot right there where the insertion is, and it's moving. That muscle is shortening and contracting and pulling that insertion toward the origin right there on the outer part of that scapula, creating this arc called lateral abduction. That is precisely, purely, exclusively what the side deltoid does. So when I say exclusively, what I mean by that is when you move your arm sideways, that side deltoid is participating in as great a percentage of the movement as it can. Yes, the side deltoid participates in other movements in lesser percentages, right? You can play basketball, you can do a variety of things, but nothing is as pure a side deltoid movement as a side raise. And of course, our objective here, when we're trying to figure out the best way to work out, is to find the things that have the least amount of compromise, right? So one of the things that we need to identify is the precise movement, and that would be it right there. So here it is in action, right? Here is the very lean guy with his arm at his side in the starting position of the side deltoid. And you can see where that muscle inserts right there beautifully. He's going to move it right to there. So that's what happens, is it raises the arms to the side. There's more going on here that I'll point out to in just a minute, but this is the movement. Okay. In this slide here, what I want you to notice is the ball and socket. The head of this humerus has a rounded, smooth surface, and that rounded, smooth surface faces inward when the palm of the hand is facing inward, your thigh, when the arm is down. Right? In other words, you haven't rotated the arm internally or externally. When it's just hanging at your side, that ball and socket fits in there perfectly. Okay, I want you to notice this little line I put there. That would be the end of the range of motion, approximately, and with the arm at the side of your body, right against the side of your torso, is the starting position. Now, you could argue or you could ask if it would be better to bring the arm across the front of the body, and there would be some joint distortion in doing that. So no, to get the longest amount of range of motion, you start with the arm at your side, and the least amount of joint distortion is the same with the arm at the side. I also want you to know this little red arrow right here. I am pointing to this bony area here called the acromion process. It's the back part of the scapula as it wraps around. Basically, it's like a shelf or an awning, right? And so by ending the movement where that line is, you prevent this bone running into that bone and squeezing the material that's in between, which we'll talk about in just a moment. But this is the ideal range of motion, and it's the ideal pathway. All right, so the other thing I want to show about what's perfect about a side raise is the upper red arrows I have here are there to indicate the position of the muscle. The position of the muscle is directly opposite this downward pull of gravity. Okay, that's what alignment requires. It requires the position of the muscle be directly on the opposite side of the direction of resistance. Now, you'll remember that in the early part of this webinar, I showed you that man pulling the rope and that clock, right? And he was pulling at a certain angle, showing that directly opposite his direction of pull, he would have the greatest amount of his efforts loading that muscle. And then the other ones would be getting a lesser and lesser and lesser percentage if they're not directly opposite his line of pull. So now we're going to look at this exercise right here, the overhead press. Now, it's safe to say that most people that are not educated in biomechanics would probably say that the two best exercises for shoulder development would be side raises and overhead presses. Overhead presses with a machine, with dumbbells, with a barbell, an overhead press. So we're going to look at the overhead press and examine what's right and what's wrong about it. Okay, so here, what you can see is the starting position of the overhead press and the starting position of the side raise. You can see that when the arms are against the side of the body, you have that early part of the range of motion for the side deltoid. Here, you don't. You're already starting quite a ways away from the early part of that range of motion. So it's safe to say that your side deltoid is therefore losing about 20%, maybe even 30% of its natural, normal, healthy range of motion. Let's look at the upper side. The upper side is the muscle is contracting nicely. You see his arm is parallel with the ground, and that means he's avoiding squeezing that bone and that acromion process together, and his deltoid is fully contracting. Now, what does fully contracting mean? That means that the origin is getting as close to the insertion as it can while you're maintaining the position of the origin. So when you go like this, what you're actually doing is you're not getting a fuller range of motion, because what's actually happening is you're pushing the scapula up. Of course, with a humerus bone, you're pushing it up, right? Squeezing what's in between and moving the origin farther away from the approaching insertion. So even though it looks like you've actually gotten a greater contraction, it is no greater. In fact, it might even be less than this would be, just because this prevents the impingement, which we'll talk about in a moment, that squeezing, and also accomplishes the mission of shortening that muscle as much as possible. So in order to do an overhead press, the first thing you have to do is rotate your arm. So this position right here, obviously if he were to put his arm straight down, you would notice that his palm is against the side of his body. But now what he's done is he has rotated his arm and up. And I'll show you what that does in just a second. But before I do that, I want to show you this little vertical line right here that I've drawn there, starting right at the elbow. And that what that shows you is that he has a slight forward tilt to his forearm. Now, different people will have different degrees of a forward tilt, depending on how much shoulder mobility they have. But clearly, it would make sense for him to try to make his forearm go vertical, and yet I'm already seeing that he can't. Most people, in fact, can't. Most people cannot, when they have their arm alongside their body, most people cannot actually make that forearm go vertical. And that means that it's entering a forward tilting plane, right? So the side of the arm is going on a side plane, but his forearm is going on a front plane, right? That means it wants to fall forward, and he has to fight. He has to do a reverse arm wrestle with it to a degree in order to keep it from falling farther forward. Because we talked about neutral levers and active levers, so when it's perfectly vertical, it doesn't need any assistance. But once it goes this way or that way, it wants to continue falling in that direction. Okay, so here I want to show you the bone, the humerus, and the surface, as I pointed out before. Now, this is in the position it would be in during a side raise. But the two questions we have to ask ourselves is, when you do this rotation, when you take this arm and you rotate it like that, what happens to that humeral head, and what happens to that muscle position? Okay, so here's what happens. Now, I've got this little device that I made here, which basically simulates an arm, right? This would be the forearm. This is the upper arm. This right here is basically the bicep that bends the forearm, that bends the elbow, right? That's what I've done. But right here, what I've done is I've created, oops, let me put it this way, what would be the side deltoid. Okay, so imagine that here's my right arm, right? And here's my deltoid, right? So this is me from the side like this, right? So when you're going to rotate your arm, you're going to first bend your arm like this, right? And you're going to raise it like this. and then you're going to go like this. So look where my side deltoid ended up. That means it is no longer on top. It is no longer on the opposite side of the downward resistance. I've shifted the alignment in a negative way. That means that my side deltoid now is going to get a significantly lesser percentage of this downward load. And what's come up on top here, as you'll see in a minute, is mostly the front deltoid, the anterior deltoid. Now, you might say, well, that's good because I also want to work the front deltoid, but there's anatomical strain that happens when you rotate your arm this way, and there's better front deltoid exercises. So there's no reason why this, an overhead press, should be your primary front deltoid exercise. So what I want you to do now, I'm going to do the same thing here, but this time I want you to see what happens to that ball and socket, right? So let's just say this is the deltoid, right? But now you're looking through there, and what you're seeing is the rotation of that ball and socket. It's going from its normal natural position where that ball was neatly placed right inside that little pocket, and now you're turning it like this, right? So what does that look like? Imagine that instead of rotating like this, now it's having to rotate like this, right? You can see what happens. That ball is not fitting in that socket as neatly as it did before, right? So you already have some joint strain based on that. In addition, there's also so much that you can rotate. So if you want to experiment with this, you can actually stand in front of a mirror and rotate your arm and see how far you can go before you start feeling pain, right? Pain, discomfort, right? And you can tell that the more you rotate, the farther you rotate, the less natural that joint feels. Now, the idea that you would have to rotate your arm all the way to the limits of comfort, to the limits of joint strain before you even start loading it, that alone is absurd. And that would be, in the best case scenario, that would be if you are actually able to make your forearm, as this man right here is showing you who cannot, if you're actually able to make your forearm go straight vertical from the side, that means it doesn't have a forward tilt. That's fine, but you still have a lot of side strain. All right, so here what I'm showing you is a guy doing an overhead press. He does not know I'm photographing him. I talked to him afterwards, of course, and granted me permission. But here, I want you to see the degree of forward slant. Now, part of this is due to the fact that he's trying to not hit his head with the barbell, right? If he was using dumbbells, he would need to do that possibly less, assuming he has the shoulder mobility. But it doesn't look here like he even has that mobility, but you can see he's passing his head. He still hasn't straightened up, and even over his head, he still has a forward slant to that forearm, in fact, the entire arm, right? So there is an enormous amount of front rotation going on in this angle. So I'm going to show you what that looks like and why that's bad. So here I want to show you the infraspinatus muscle. This is the external shoulder rotator. This is the muscle that prevents that barbell from falling forward because of that forearm, that forward forearm tilt. So you can see that when the arm is down, this muscle wraps around the humeral head and pulls that head around towards these green dots, which is the muscle origin. Okay, so here's a side view where you can see it's going to grab this outer part of this humeral head and pull it backward. Right? But when it does so, in other words, all of these efforts of these muscles contracting are pulling in the same direction you want to rotate that arm. If you're rotating the arm this way, that rotation is moving in the same direction as these origins, okay? But watch what happens when you're in an overhead press position. When your arm is to the side of you like this, and that forearm tilt is trying to rotate that humerus forward. This muscle right here, the one that's on this side, the infraspinatus, is the only, well, the primary muscle, the main muscle that is tasked with the job of keeping it from falling farther forward. But what you're trying to do, whether you know it or not, is actually rotate this arm toward the B position. But your infraspinatus isn't pulling from the B position. It's pulling from over here, from the C position. So imagine how much this muscle has to work and strain in order to use that mechanical disadvantage of having, let's say, 70% of its effort be wasted because it's pulling mostly in and not in a productive way within the direction. So most people that have shoulder pain, this is part of the rotator cuff group, have pain in that infraspinatus. You can go up to someone, or you can have someone go up to you and push on your infraspinatus, and you will likely feel pain there because that muscle is often strained anytime you do any kind of press, whether it's a chest press or an overhead press or an incline press, and your forearm isn't lined up vertically and you have some of that forward tilt, you're going to be straining your infraspinatus. It's inevitable. Okay, so now we're going to talk about this thing here called impingement syndrome. And again, back to this line here. When you move that arm up and over that line and squeeze what is in between there, what is in between there? Well, you have, here's your acromion process, you have a bursa sac. A bursa sac is basically a little gelatinous material pack that basically is meant to cushion the occasional times when you have to put a shelf on a box on a shelf or grab an apple off of a tree or whatever it is that you're going to do. In other words, we can reach up with our arms, yes. But if you do it often, a lot, and when you do it with weight, then now you start to wear that out. And this little muscle right here, that is called the supraspinatus. The supraspinatus is on the back of your shoulder blade. It crosses through the underneath the acromion process, and it ties into the top of the humeral head right there. And it has two jobs. One job is to keep that humeral head in the socket, and the other is to start the first 10% or so, 10 degrees of the range of motion of a lateral abduction, of an arm raise. But when you raise this arm up and you squeeze that tendon and that bursa in between the acromion process and the humerus, the head of the humerus, it's going to eventually get inflamed. It could eventually rupture. It could tear. It could need to be surgically reattached. There's all kinds of things that happen. Who gets impingement syndromes? Well, swimmers get it because they're repeatedly going like this. But if you're doing an overhead press, that downward push of the weight is holding down the scapula. So when you do a pull down, you're raising your arms up, but there's nothing pushing down on your scapula, right? So it's easier for the scapula to move away from the rising humerus. But when you're pushing down on all of it, it's much harder for that scapula to shift away and create some space. So you have basically something holding down the shelf while the upper arm bone squeezes the material underneath there.